The serenity and the beauty of the Great Lakes hides many secrets, and as you look over this very interesting rock face at the wonder of Lake Superior going off into the horizon, you could be understood to realize that there doesn't appear to be any sort of mystery here. It's a beautiful natural area, and yet the Great Lakes behind its veneer of beauty hides many mysteries. There are many strange occurrences, such as odd architecture with the Perry Victory and International Peace Monument. There's also the fact that the Great Lakes don't appear on many early maps. Perhaps the cartographers were simply not aware of them. We have many shipping losses that have occurred in the Great Lakes throughout the years. Strange weather phenomenon. And one wouldn't expect that to be the case. Yet there's not a single graveyard in the Great Lakes. Every single one of the Great Lakes is a massive shipping graveyard. So what's exactly the situation here? Do we have strange weather patterns? Is it simply a place where perfect storms occur? We also have the presence of these very intriguing cities, such as Chicago or Shilaga on Lake Michigan. And least we forget Cleveland, another city that we've explored off Lake Erie. Many great cities and many strange phenomenon, along with Milwaukee. Why is it we have these mysteries on the Great Lakes? And why is this such an overlooked area? Join me as we explore these mysteries and try to unravel this vortex in the terrifying Great Lakes. The first question is the map anomaly. Why are the Great Lakes not actually on the maps that we have? When you look at the Great Lakes, if you're not familiar with the area, it's well known for being a very peaceful and serene area, especially the landscape around it. This is also stated to be the largest freshwater ecosystem in the land, and it's in the middle of North America. Although it should be noted that there are larger sources of fresh water in South America and in Asia from Russia at this day. But the Great Lakes has a special mystery and beauty behind it that many overlook because it does seem like it's a peaceful area. And the first anomaly being the maps. Ah yes, this lovely map where we have California depicted as an island. We do actually have a large body of water here in these rather strange mountains that look to be where Wisconsin and Iowa are today, running east to west. But perhaps the cartographers simply didn't know about the presence of the lakes. It is rather strange though, since we understand the first explorations of North America to occur were done on boats, going down the waterways and looking for different points of interest. And it's rather odd that such large lakes, which the Great Lakes are indeed very large, would be missed by the early cartographers. But again, it was early exploration, and perhaps it just simply took them a little period of time to understand the land. That may not be as mysterious as it seems. But again, it's another oddity because we do have these early maps that were made by cartographers who needed to know exactly how to depict the various sea routes and the understanding of the land for proper navigation. And even on these later maps where we see we don't have the dramatic depiction of California as an island, we still don't have any Great Lakes. We do have Shilaga present, at least where we would expect Chicago to be, although some argue it's Montreal, and maybe it is. Who knows for sure? That's the whole point though. It's rather odd that these maps would be so precise and yet omit a major detail as the Great Lakes. And we have Florida depicted in wonderful detail here, and we have these other strange cities or castles or whatever this is really supposed to claim, and other odd settlements that seem to be properly labeled. Now really go back in time and think about this as they were making these maps. How could there really be so many misconceptions yet with exact coordinates, which you can really take from the lines of latitude and longitude on these early maps? It's always mystified me with the fact that we don't have the Great Lakes shown on so many of them. And indeed, it's not until you reach the maps of the 1700s and the 1800s when you start to see even the early depictions of the Great Lakes. Although, another oddity is that even some of the later maps omit them, when we'd expect them to be there. I mean, really think on this. This is the largest freshwater ecosystem in the world, and yet it was omitted from these maps of exploration. We had these great Spanish and French explorers that were trumping all over the land of North America, and yet somehow they missed the Great Lakes. But they did manage to properly catalog certain mountain ranges, or mountain ranges that weren't there anymore. Again, it's just that odd fact with maps that we don't always know exactly what we're looking at, and we have so many variations. Norumbega. What exactly is Norumbega? So many different questions and so many considerations. And yet as time passed, you can see that eventually the Great Lakes did find their way onto the early maps. But it's rather strange that it seemed to be the St. Lawrence Seaway which was gradually widened, and then all of a sudden the lakes appeared in the later maps. Now, really consider that question. Was there actually a time when the Great Lakes were not present? Well, official history tells us that the Great Lakes were formed very recently, but certainly not within the last couple hundreds of years. And then we also see other variations of maps with California still depicted as an island or a separate landmass, but we do have some larger bodies of water. But again, you can see here that it seems to be incomplete and uncertain. So perhaps the explorers, the cartographers, they just simply didn't understand exactly where everything was. But again, the fact that this persisted for such a long period of time, when we had accurate navigation methods, it does seem to be the first prevalent mystery behind the Great Lakes. That real question of, were they always there? Were they always there even in more recent times than we'd like to believe? Because if these maps were accurate, and if they were properly surveyed, then we should see the Great Lakes on them, but we see absolutely nothing showing any sort of lake. And why is that the situation? Now, of course, as along with everything else, it seems as though the first proper maps that fully cataloged and surveyed the Great Lakes came from the 1800s or the late 1700s, depending on if you accept the original publication and composition time for these maps. And we finally start to get the sign that there are Great Lakes there, even with the proper names. It's such an anomaly because of the fact that if you think about how large these Great Lakes are, how could they have ever been missed? But of course, once the 1800s came along, the entire United States came into being, and it seems as though the Great Lakes came into being. Now, I'm speaking with dramatic flair in this particular situation, but it is very strange to me. And I think it's one of the most compelling mysteries that there was a time on many maps that there were no Great Lakes displayed at all. And again, it's only on the more recent maps. It is rather strange that we have so many events that allude to the 1800s. Officially, the Great Lakes were formed by the passage of glaciers, and we'll take a brief look at that from our scientific interpretations of it, and look at our official mainstream explanation for why the Great Lakes exist. I remember my first understanding of the Great Lake Superior having enough water in it to flood all of North and South America a foot deep. I don't know if that fact is true, but that's something that was relayed to me in one of my early classes. And here you can see the whole concept of how glaciers are stated to have passed over this landscape. And very recently, within the last 10 to 12,000 years, again, we always have these precise dates from the past, these glaciers passed over the landscape, left dead ice behind, and this is what is responsible for the very exact and precise formation of the Great Lakes, the glacial formation of the Great Lakes. I've always found it intriguing, though, that this did not happen in other portions of the land. This only happened very specifically in North America. Now, I'm not suggesting that this is impossible, merely pointing out the fact that this is a unique occurrence. All of these incredible lakes formed by this glacier all in this exact same period. And here we have the statement 12,500 years before present. Now, there's even claims that there were natives and inhabitants that witnessed this all happen right in front of their eyes. Although granted, it was on a very long timeline. Although with our normal chronology, we tend to see that natural formations such as this don't take place over a couple hundred or even a couple thousand years. It's usually something that takes place over millions of years. And so right here we already have a strange anomaly in addition to the map concept with the Great Lakes. They aren't on the earlier maps, and it seems as though even the scientific explanation says that they formed very recently. And when you go to the landscape and the area around the Great Lakes, you will find that there are many intriguing anomalies that even go past their legend of natural formation. And yes, I say legend of natural formation because there are claims there were inhabitants that actually witnessed this happen. But there's lots of remnants of very intriguing architecture and infrastructure that exist across the Great Lakes. Again, we could say it's easily explainable because there's many natural resources that flow out of the Great Lakes. There's also an incredible amount of shipwrecks all over. And there's many different explanations to explain the situation for why what we would expect to be peaceful inland lakes, even if they are large, have so many vicious weather situations within them. And why are all the Great Lakes known to be ship graveyards? It's another one of those puzzling mysteries that seems to be overlooked. Here you have it, the maps of the graveyard of the Great Lakes. In Lake Superior, all of these ships that have sunk or disappeared over time. Now, the prevailing explanation is that there is a unique weather condition that exists within the Great Lakes. And one of these weather conditions is called the Three Sisters in Lake Superior, a series of 3 rogue waves brought about by extreme weather conditions. Again, not exactly something that we'd be expecting. And perhaps one of the most famous shipwrecks on Lake Superior being the loss of the Edmund Fitzgerald, which occurred very recently in the 1970s. And when you look at Lake Michigan, you'll see that it's no different. A vast array of shipwrecks and shipping losses over the years. I'm also impressed by the fact that we have a very precise and exact record, going all the way back to the 1600s, of every single large ship that was lost over time in these Great Lakes. Again, I'm not suggesting that it's impossible. It's just intriguing that we have these documents and these records so well kept. Because oftentimes when we have shipping losses, they tend to be obfuscated with legend and myth. Many times we'll have people that are skeptics or investigators who will tell us that shipping losses are merely the subject of myth and legend and that they didn't really happen. Or if we did in fact have all these major wrecks in 1600 here in Lake Huron, that they are very well documented and well known, and we know that every single one of these ships were lost due to unfortunate circumstances. But there's no mystery. There's never any mystery. Although when we look deeper into the legends and the myths behind the Great Lakes, we start to see that there are many more mysteries. We looked at their formation and the lack of the fact that they're on early maps. And now we have this strange weather phenomenon that occurs, not just in Lake Superior, but in all of the Great Lakes, with all of these shipping losses, and every single one of the Great Lakes being a true ship graveyard. Not exactly what we'd expect. And if you talk to mariners, they will tell you that, for the most part, sailing on the Great Lakes is rather easy, that there is no real weather difficulty to be expected. But then, contrary to their initial expectations, once bad weather comes up, it becomes some of the most difficult conditions many of them have seen. Now, what are really the differences between sailing on a freshwater lake and sailing in the open ocean? What are the different challenges? Many people will tell you, even beyond mariners, that they wouldn't expect the Great Lakes to be a difficult place to sail. We all understand that it makes sense for logistics to go outside the Great Lakes, and there's many products that are produced and shipped out on the St. Lawrence Seaway to the open ocean. The loss of the Edmund Fitzgerald, as recently as 1975, and Gordon Lightfoot, of course, did the song on it. And there's mystery behind this because the Edmund Fitzgerald was very well documented, quote unquote, and it was very well tracked as it went off on its path, and yet suddenly encountered very bad weather. Of course, this is one of the many hundreds of ships that we see that have been lost over time. Is there some sort of strange phenomenon that occurs on the Great Lakes? Some bizarre weather pattern that occurs that may be the result of some other forces even beyond weather? There's no doubt that there are rogue weather patterns that occur all over the land at strange times, but there do seem to be certain areas where these strange weather patterns occur with some sort of habitual recurrence. And why is this? Why is it that this legend of the Three Sisters, which apparently doesn't seem to be as much of a legend as we might think, exist on the Great Lakes? How is it that there are these weather phenomenon that can cause these very extensive shipping losses in these, what are supposed to be, easy to traverse inland seas. And these are freshwater seas. Granted that they're large enough and filled with a lot of water to be somewhat intimidating, because I still remember that factor, whether it's true or not, that there's enough water in Lake Superior to flood all of North and South America a foot deep. Who knows? Maybe there's a lot more water in it than we can imagine. But there are documentations and official accounts of horrific weather patterns that have affected shipping over the years on the Great Lakes, to say nothing for sailing there during the winter, because we are operating here at more northern latitudes. And I think that's one of the things that's always drawn me to the mystery of the Great Lakes that tends to be overlooked, because there are a lot of shipping losses. And by the way, there's not just shipping losses. There's also been numerous aviation incidences around the Great Lakes. And indeed, the area was featured in an In Search Of episode, The Mystery of the Great Lakes. And oddly enough, people tend to overlook it because they see the serenity and beauty of the Great Lakes, and also the fact that it is a major area for population. There are many cities on the Great Lakes, and they don't think of it as an area of mystery. But is it possible that there's something much more insidious going on here? That there could be some strange implications of bizarre electromagnetic phenomenon that are occurring on the Great Lakes. There's even the presence of the original Agonic Line that flowed through the middle of the Great Lakes. Now, you may recall the Agonic Line that we've explored in the past. It's constantly shifting over time, which is very odd in and of itself, because the existence of this line might be a reference to the changing of magnetic forces over time. And again, it could be another reference to strange phenomena that are occurring that we can't easily explain. And whether we're in the Great Lakes or in that little area of the Caribbean that we've talked about and explored in the past, could there be a connection? Could it even be possible that we're looking at some old effects from some technology of a previous civilization? Again, these will be dismissed by skeptics as simply being the wild imagination of people looking for explanations when there are none. That it's simply the reality of the Great Lakes that were very recently formed, weren't depicted on early maps, and seem to have been very recently discovered, that they just have these strange weather patterns that exist upon them. That it can be hazardous to sail a ship at any point in time through these strange weather patterns. Again, even though you're on an inland sea of fresh water, and you would expect the fact that you are completely surrounded by land to mitigate any weather patterns. And there's the aviation losses that have occurred over time. Many strange documented situations where entire planes have crashed or disappeared. And this is certainly not what we'd expect, because at the altitude that you fly, you're typically always going to see the land from any direction that you look. This isn't flying a plane over the ocean where it's ocean all the way out to the horizon. You're out in inland sea. You're in the middle of North America. Why would this be a difficult area where we have aviation losses? And yet again, we have numerous aviation losses, very well documented aviation losses, within our friends the media talking about an airplane carrying 58 missing over Lake Michigan. And again, how large is Lake Michigan, especially from the air? Perhaps we could understand some ships being lost due to weather phenomenon, but what about these strange aviation losses that tend not to make a lot of sense? Why is it we have airplanes that have disappeared frequently over the Great Lakes? And we even have this memorial to Northwest Flight 2501, disappeared or went down June 23rd, 1950. Now, all these people who lost their lives, perhaps it is just an isolated aviation incident. And certainly accidents do occur, but why are there so many of them? And why is it the fact that this phenomenon seems to be confined to the Great Lakes and the area around the Great Lakes? There comes a point in time when you have a situation that recurs so many times that you have to start paying attention to it. There are rumors, legends, and myths of a triangle of doom or a zone of doom that exists over Lake Michigan, where there's been an extreme series of losses of both ships and planes over time. Now, you can certainly look at the records yourself and attempt to ascertain if there is something to this theory. Anytime we have an area of land or water that's designated, and typically whenever there's a triangle, well, then that's where we tend to have the issue of understanding why these phenomenon exist. because oftentimes skeptics will say, this doesn't exist, it's merely the product of imagination, or I'm going to sit out and I'm going to debunk this. Just because there's a lot of ships and a lot of planes that went down in this particular area doesn't necessarily mean there's anything strange going on. But this goes beyond just shipping and plane losses over time. We also have unexplained phenomenon, numerous UFOs, very strange weather patterns that have been seen in and around the Great Lakes over time. Now, what exactly are UFOs? Unidentified flying objects, or unidentified aerial phenomenon, as we seem to have renamed them here in the 2000s? But whatever you want to say, it's hard to ignore the fact that there are so many accounts of these strange events all centered around this area. Again, perhaps it is just an incredible coincidence. Maybe there's something within this fresh water that simply causes us to believe that there's weird events and we simply can't come up with an explanation. On the topic of strange events, let's explore the really unique architecture of the Perry Victory and International Peace Monument. This is to commemorate the victory of Oliver Hazard Perry, a U.S. naval hero during the very interesting War of 1812, when he managed to build a fleet on Lake Erie and defeated the British fleet, which was also built on the other side of Lake Erie, in a decisive naval conflict in 1812. This monument was constructed, according to official sources, from 1912 to 1915. It happens to be the largest Doric column in the world. Of course it's the largest Doric column in the world. What else would it be? And constructed right before World War I, at least the United States entry into World War I. How fascinating. This was apparently a very decisive victory, this Battle of Lake Erie that Oliver Hazard Perry led. And for whatever reason, it stopped the attempted British control of the Great Lakes. I find it rather fascinating, though, that it wasn't really that decisive because at the time the British had the greatest navy in the world, and they did actually land an expeditionary force that burned Washington, D.C. to the ground. But for whatever reason, securing the Great Lakes was decisive, winning the War of 1812. Also rather strange that the War of 1812 was named after a year and not something else. You know, the War of Preventing Sailor Impressment or something. I guess it just doesn't sound as cool. I mean, why hasn't there ever been another war that's been named after a year? Beyond that, we do have early construction photos of this impressive Doric column. And of course, we see the exact same construction techniques that we've seen in all the other construction photos that we have of virtually all the structures that were built from, 1860 to 1930, it seems like. Now, maybe it's possible. Maybe we did really build this structure. And maybe we had individuals such as this, people who worked 24 hours a day, 6 days a week, and only had Sundays off when they would spend the entire day in church, who constructed these very, very impressive blocks that completed the Perry International Peace and Victory Monument. Yes, I'm mixing it up there. It's just intriguing to me that this monument is to commemorate Perry's victory over the British, but then it's also to celebrate the peace that's existed between the United States, Canada, and Great Britain. I guess that was still a big thing in the early 1900s, prior to the special relationship that was enjoyed by the United States and the United Kingdom, and of course the subsequent signing of the Atlantic Charter. Seriously, look into the Atlantic Charter, it's quite intriguing. But on the interior of this very impressive monument, once again we see interesting symbols, and we see construction techniques and detailing that we certainly don't see the construction photos really convincing us that this was all done. Now again, I'm not saying that we didn't actually have the evidence that our civilization built this impressive monument. It's just rather strange that some of the most dramatic and beautiful artistic impressions, especially on the interior, we never have construction photos that really detail how those were completed. Well, perhaps nobody wanted to photograph that. It would just simply be boring. We've got 3 very hardworking individuals in a photograph that were clearly shaping the blocks, and that should be good enough for us. And maybe we did indeed construct this. But once again, it's rather odd to think of the fact that we don't build monuments like this anymore. And keep in mind that this was also stated to have been done by a multi-state commission, because again, what else would it be whenever we're looking for an explanation on something like this? I've always found this strange, though, that the largest Doric column just happens to be off of Lake Erie. I mean, I know that, Perry's victory was an incredible moment for an American triumph, and the War of 1812 was the time when the United States really displayed that it was finally a power that was truly free of the control of Great Britain and subsequently the United Kingdom. At least that's what the official history says about it. Again, that very odd war that happened while the Napoleonic Wars were occurring, and for whatever reason was a very indecisive conflict. It also showed that there were limitations in terms of what could be done, but then for whatever reason, large expeditionary forces could be landed overseas and sustained over time. Very interesting icons and symbols, though, that continue to appear on this impressive monument, this monument for victory and international peace. Although, how exactly do you say it's international peace when you're talking three nations? Don't ask me. It's very intriguing, though. Does it give us the impression that perhaps there is some other origin to this particular monument? Maybe these symbols mean something else and have an entirely different explanation behind them. Because I'm always amazed at the fact that we have these symbols that don't seem to match what we would think of as the traditional symbols of, well, the United States, the United Kingdom, and Canada at that particular time frame. I mean, you can see we've got the three modern national flags there hanging up, so I guess that's how we say it's the International Peace Monument, to say nothing of what was actually put on the walls in painstaking detail, and whatever the true materials of it were. And then in this nearby museum at this display, you'll see a more modern statue that depicts the great U.S. naval hero Oliver Hazard Perry himself. We have met the enemy, and they are ours. And yet, once again, you can see that, it's a statue, but you look at the very impressive, tallest Doric column in the world in the background. I mean, yes, it is. It does appear to be made out of blocks, so maybe we did it. But it's, again, just another oddity. Because whenever you look in the interior of these impressive monuments, you again see construction and detailing that seem to be beyond what would have been the expected capabilities at the time. Now again, the explanation is, well, they didn't have bureaucracy, they didn't have safety standards, and people work 6 days a week, or 7 days a week in many cases. They didn't need to eat, they didn't need to defecate, all they did was they worked. They worked. They never had any time or consideration for leisure, never mind the fact that we had amusement parks that were very well documented in that time as well, and that's how they were able to complete these very impressive constructions. And in the past, we just simply had more of a paramount importance that we devoted to our national monuments, and our state monuments while we're at it, that we could adorn them to be so incredibly beautiful on the exterior, but then in the interior make them accessible to the individual. I always think about how the Sir Walter Scott Monument in Edinburgh in Scotland has an interior walkway and stairways in it, because I guess you need those things. And this is the view of the very surrounding and modest community that you can see from the Perry Monument. So once again, it's a series of questions that, again, don't have many good answers. I mean, you can look at those photos and you can accept the fact that, yes, those photos do very well document the construction of the Perry Monument. I mean, why we don't have a better chronology of photos that show it from start to finish, maybe there were just limitations. But again, going beyond this monument to other cities and communities, such as Duluth off of Lake Superior, there do seem to be many mysteries and anomalies. The rapid formation here of the canal zone in Duluth, Minnesota. This particular canal was stated to have been dug out by the good people of Duluth when they didn't want to lose their port and their shipping rights to nearby Superior in Wisconsin. So the people went out with their shovels and they dug out this entire canal zone. Yes, it makes perfect sense, doesn't it? And that's exactly what we're informed happened. Then, of course, the Army Corps of Engineers showed up because I guess the U.S. government had an interest in making sure that Duluth would be the major port and not Superior, Wisconsin, and that's how they completed this very impressive canal zone. Yes, the aerial lift bridge is quite an engineering wonder as well, and who knows what the real origin on it is. We're assured that we constructed it, and oddly enough, when you look at its origin, it actually wasn't an aerial lift bridge. It was a ferry bridge, and then they converted it into an aerial lift bridge. Very interesting from an engineering point of view. And Duluth has many unique architectural anomalies within it, from Central High School that we've looked at before. And you can look at the foundation of Duluth, another one of these interesting cities that grew up in a very short amount of time off the Great Lakes. And apparently Duluth was so successful that the people of Georgia decided to name one of their new communities after it. And this occurred in the 1870s. right after Georgia was still reeling from Sherman's march, but I guess they got over the Civil War pretty quickly. Whenever you look at these impressive monuments, whether you're in Cleveland or Detroit, you oftentimes see this. This isn't just the Perry Monument, but there's many others that commemorate the Civil War, the war between the states, or the War of the Great Rebellion, or all the other names that we seem to have for it from the 1800s. And you again see some very interesting construction materials that are used. You also see an interesting amalgamation of symbols that don't seem to conform or match. It's very intriguing when you think about how this all lines up with the fact that we do have some symbols that we might expect to see that do seem to represent what we think of as the United States at the time, but then we have conflicting symbols that don't seem to match exactly what we're seeing. They seem to represent something else. Now, is it possible that there was still a focus on these particular symbols at the time? I suppose so, but it's always interesting how the more defined depictions of the United States Civil War usually seem to be added on later, and then on the actual monument itself you see conflicting symbols that we'd not expect to see, such as the little wreath and the diamond in the background. What exactly is that supposed to be representing? The Great Union 12th Corps of Ohio? I'm not really sure. But you see this in all the Civil War monuments all across the land. And oddly enough, monuments in other lands where they didn't have a U.S. Civil War do seem to look rather the same. All of this in the Great Lakes area. All of these mysteries, this architecture, these disappearing ships, these strange weather phenomena, these magnetic forces, these sightings of strange aerial phenomenon, or unidentified flying objects, the loss of aviation over time, and other strange things that are observed in and around the Great Lakes. It tells us that there are many more mysteries behind the serenity and beauty. And now let us take a look underneath the surface of the Great Lakes. It's under the surface of the Great Lakes that we find even more strange structural phenomenon, ruins that appear to be sunken. Some people who say that these are the remnants of the Great Lakes' own monolith, if you will, or their own Stonehenge. Now, I haven't actually personally dived and explored these particular ruins, but the fact that they're at the bottom of the Great Lakes is yet another mystery. Is it possible that what we're looking at here is the remnant of some sort of great structure that may have once been part of an apparatus that was part of a greater technology, including magnetic forces over time? Could it have been that the civilization that came before us not only had the power to fashion the Great Lakes artificially, utilizing great means of technology, but they also had the power to change the very magnetic forces that are present in the Great Lakes? Is it possible that the agonic line is more than simply a line where magnetic north is 0 degrees and there's no declination, but it could actually be a line where realities meet, where we have multiple different physical realities, that there is still the possibility that they overlap because of the fact that this technology is still active in some way, shape, or form? There are many anomalous ruins both above and below the surface in the Great Lakes area. And if you get around to the Great Lakes, whether you're around Lake Superior or Lake Michigan, you'll find that beyond all of these particular ruins, there's no shortage of very impressive and anomalous structures, things that you wouldn't expect to see. Not only are we talking about the lighthouses, we're talking about early forts, early structures, and then of course there's all the impressive, unique, anomalous architecture in the great cities that we've explored, such as Chicago, Cleveland, Milwaukee, Duluth, and many others. And so it just continues to overlap all these mysteries that we have with this particular area. For example, this particular terrain feature, this rock formation. We're certainly to understand that this is a natural rock formation according to official sources, and yet when we look at it and study it, we can't help but wonder if there's a little bit more behind it. Is it possible that this could be the remnant of some artificial structure? Of course, we know that that's not to be the case if we accept the mainstream explanation behind things. But there's also the numerous reports of unidentified flying objects, or as we say now, unidentified aerial phenomenon, that are associated with the Great Lakes. Why is it that this is such a confluence of so many different mysteries? You realize that there is much more behind the wonders of the Great Lakes. There are also terrors to behold. Could it be that these are just simply visual anomalies, and when you explore the waters, you'll find no shortage of interesting little land masses such as this, that once again cause you to question if this is really just simply a natural formation. Could this be the remnants of some previous great artificial formation? And you'll find this all over the Great Lakes, whether you're on Lake Superior, Lake Huron, Lake Michigan, Lake Ontario, or Lake Erie. The very strange structures that are both above and below the surface. And going back to the strange weather phenomenon that occur in the Great Lakes. The strange weather phenomenon being used to explain all the shipping losses over the last hundreds of years that have been very well documented and are very well known. Waterspouts and tornadoes that occur, along with the very difficult weather conditions and extreme wind, to say nothing of the Three Sisters or the three rogue waves that'll appear in Lake Superior. Or do they appear in all the Great Lakes? And this is the reason why we have these extensive shipping losses. There's also the unique formation of rather impressive ice patches on the top of the Great Lakes. And you'll find that these ice patches are very aesthetically pleasing and yet oddly symmetrical. Now again, this is a natural phenomenon, but it is a very unique natural phenomenon, where you have formations of ice such as this. I suppose you could say it's much in the same way that a snowflake forms. And yet this is something that seems to be confined to the Great Lakes, where you have ice appearing on the surface in these very impressive natural and symmetrical patterns. Is it possible there may be another explanation behind this, or again, is it just simply a natural phenomenon that we just accept? So many intricacies and so many wonders to behold upon the Great Lakes. And whether you visit them in the summer or the winter, spring or the fall, there's always something unique about it. And if you're someone who's more used to swimming in places like the Caribbean, I strongly suggest you get used to immersing yourself in very cold water, as the Great Lakes will no doubt seem very cold to you, even if you go in August. The weather patterns have been well known over years, and yet we have the indication that perhaps the weather patterns are becoming more severe. Yet the official historical account also indicates that the weather patterns have always been severe along the Great Lakes. So is there a definitive reason for this, or is it just because of their unique location? Why is it that we have so many exceptions for the very existence of the Great Lakes? And I would be remiss if I didn't mention the fact that there was actually a cyclone, a hurricane-like storm that did occur over Lake Huron in the mid-1990s. Certainly something that defies all of our explanation or expectations, because we'd expect a hurricane to happen somewhere in the ocean, the Caribbean, any one of the gulfs across the land, or the areas where we have hurricanes, but not over Lake Huron. But this really did happen. So is there another reason for this? There's also the rumors of the very unexpected vortexes that have occurred in Lake Ontario. Now, it's intriguing to think that the explanation for these vast shipping losses over the last several hundred years vary between the Great Lakes. Is it all because of odd weather patterns, or is there something else going on? Indeed, there are even rumors that at the bottom of Lake Ontario are some rather enigmatic structures. Again, these structures that may be reflecting the remnants of an apparatus of a previous civilization. Or again, it could just all be an incredible coincidence. But here you see this interesting shoal structure that looks rather artificial in my mind, but maybe it's just my imagination, and again, I haven't actually been down there, and that this is the explanation for the formation of this vortex. Does it have something to do with it on the bottom of Lake Ontario? Or again, is it all just part of that incredible massive coincidence? Looking at some of the land formations in the very coasts of the Great Lakes, you do also witness some rather dramatic changes between how the land alters from the lake to the actual height of it. Or, if you recall looking at the opening video of this particular exploration, you notice that there's some rather interesting rock formations, ridge lines, and a mixture of rubble along with overall great rock. Now again, it could be natural, but one can't simply dismiss the fact that there are many legends that indicate that there were great serpents that once existed in the Great Lakes. Is it possible that the Great Lakes were actually formed artificially in their entirety by this previous civilization? Now I know this sounds like a very dramatic and far-fetched explanation or theory, but consider the possibility. mainstream sources indicate that the Great Lakes formed relatively recently in the grand sequence of geological processes. There's also the understanding that if the Great Lakes were formed artificially by a previous civilization, perhaps they had some other reason for doing it. Did it provide this ecosystem that they were trying to nourish certain types of life? Or did they have some other aims entirely that go beyond our ability to explain? Or again, it could just simply be a massive coincidence. Perhaps if you go around Lake Superior on the north side, maybe you'll find a borad wandering around from Carful. And if anybody understands this reference, please let me know in the comments. But looking at the profile of the Great Lakes, we can see how the elevation changes and the depth of each of the lakes. It's intriguing to think of the fact that we haven't actually mapped or understand the bottom of all the lakes, and yet they are relatively deep. Certainly not anywhere as deep as the ocean, so we would expect to have a better understanding of each of the Great Lakes. It's also intriguing when you think of the changes in this elevation going from the Atlantic Ocean to the Great Lakes themselves, and how little of an understanding we actually have of what lies beneath the surface. Again, it could just all be a series of coincidences. All coincidences that all just happen to have a confluence in this particular area of land known as the Great Lakes. That these shipping losses were all just the result of bad weather, bad luck, or hard-charging captains, such as the captain of the Edmund Fitzgerald, who is stated to be one of those skippers who took his ship into all kinds of difficult weather conditions. Although one has to ask the question, how exactly does one go about avoiding difficult weather in the Great Lakes if they are beset by difficult weather all the time? When you look at a map such as this, it doesn't seem like the shipping losses are that extensive, but if you recall the earlier maps we look at, they are quite extensive, and they are very well documented in full detail all the way back to the 1600s. So taking it all together, what do we have with the Great Lakes, this land of wonder and this land of terror? Is it possible that there are anomalies and enigmas here that we will never fully explain or understand? Why is it that we had a certain researcher who just happened to be from Racine, Wisconsin, who decided not to even investigate any of these strange mysteries in the Great Lakes? As he was a research librarian, you would think that would have been one of his first considerations to debunk the great mysteries by his homeland. But he decided to focus on the Caribbean for reasons unknown. And that seems to be the situation, that many people do overlook what we have with these mysteries of the Great Lakes, even though this is right in the backyard of both Canada and the United States. There's also the presence of these many impressive lighthouses across all the Great Lakes, such as Split Rock Lighthouse here, vicinity 2 Harbors in Minnesota, north of Duluth. Here you have one of these very impressive lighthouses that was constructed, for what we understand, was the warning of navigation for ships on the Great Lakes to prevent shipping losses. And this was purported to have been constructed in the early 1900s, but you can see that there's some very impressive construction in this very isolated area. Indeed, Duluth and 2 Harbors are two very interesting communities to explore from an old world perspective. Now again, I will say it's possible we could have constructed this lighthouse in our current civilization, but you can go walk this site today and come to your own conclusions. I've been here, and I will admit that there are some rather unique anomalies with this particular site. Even the quarters for the lighthouse keepers are very well constructed brick establishments. Now, it is possible that they did it and they put all this effort into it, but it's very interesting when you step back and you explore this particular site in person, which I recommend if you have the ability to do that you do. You'll get the idea that it hints at something much more than just simply a lighthouse and some quarters that are located by it. Here we have our construction photo, and once again we have our iron frame construction that always seems to accompany anything with brick and masonry constructions from the late 1800s to the early 1900s. Is that really what this is? Why do we have an individual that's just standing on top of that iron frame and not even balancing themselves? It's as though they don't care if they take the fatal plunge. And maybe they didn't. You know, they were working so hard all the time, 6 days a week with only Sunday off, with Sunday spent all day in church, and they walked uphill to school and worked both ways. But if you can actually get on site to Split Rock Lighthouse, I advise paying close attention to the natural terrain. and also the break between what we understand to be the lighthouse foundation itself and the natural terrain. They seem to be very well blended together. And that's the mystery that we have, along with the fact that many of these lighthouses are stated to have haunted apparitions with them. Who knows exactly what's going on overall with the Great Lakes? There are so many different visual and physical anomalies to be encountered. Now, of course, you can just simply hand wave it all away and say that it's all a massive coincidence. It just happens to be the only largest freshwater ecosystem in the land that's in the middle of North America. And there's nothing else quite like it anywhere. There are so many different mysteries, so many wonders and terrors that we could explore in much great detail with all the Great Lakes and all the settlements and cities and accounts with them. We could dive underwater and spend endless amounts of time looking at the ruins and trying to find an exact explanation, some sort of understanding for why is it these lakes that, even according to mainstream science, have formed rather recently, have all of these mysteries associated with them. But as always, I leave it to you. It could well be that the mainstream explanation is correct. It could well be that this is just simply a confluence of many different anomalies. Shipping losses, strange weather phenomenon, the Agonic Line, these sightings of UFOs, all the product of imagination, all in one particular geographical area. Or it could be this really is an area that does have some tremendous significance to it. What do you think? Let me know in the comments. Do you think there's anything unique, terrifying, or special with the Great Lakes? Well, thank you for joining me. Please like, comment, and subscribe.